The last work Kent Bellows created before his untimely death in 2005 is the drawing seen here, an enigmatic drawing he titled North by Northwest. Art historians aren't always given such intriguing entrees into works of art as the name of an Alfred Hitchcock thriller. It seems more often than not our job involves explicating the content of something called Untitled. So consequently, for some time now, I've been looking closely at this work in order to uncover the significance of its title, if there is one. From my prior research into Bellows' art and life, I knew that he was a movie buff. I learned early on from the artist's friends that his favorite film was Akira Kurosawa's Rashomon, a fact that at the time I filed away for future use. And I knew from seeing Bellows' studio that he loved all things related to alien and monster movies. So North by Northwest, what did this work have to do with Hitchcock? I wondered, only to discover that its secrets aren't given up so easily. With its background of broad gestural smudges, suggestive perhaps of the abstract expressionist works of Franz Klein, whom Bellows admired, the majority of the drawing is faint and indistinct. The head, torso, and thighs of a female figure are recognizable. Well, not really in here, but right here, along with a man's head and shoulders, which is almost impossible to see there. And here, and you can see the contours of a human hand here. In the upper left-hand corner, Bellows has written the word sing. You can barely see that there. And the word pedicle, or something like that, appears on this mysterious object, which seems to be hanging from some sort of organic limb. And there's the intentional burning found in the work. Why would Bellows have done this? The drawing really was, and in many ways still is, a mystery. But the more I thought about the work, and in particular its relation to film and Bellows' engagement with that medium, possible meanings began to suggest themselves, meanings which I'll return to at the end of my talk. Right now I'm going to go back into the past. In 1955, at the age of almost 6, Kent Bellows took up his crayons and put down on paper a scene from the Disney movie Pinocchio in a multi-figured composition that my own 9.5-year-old could not even begin to conceive of. The kindergarten-age Bellows renders a dancing Pinocchio complete with articulated elbows and knees, all the necessary facial features, floppy hat, clunky shoes, bow tie, and gloved hands. To Pinocchio's right, Bellows drew a leaping Jiminy Cricket, tricked out in top hat and coat and with his ever-present umbrella. And to his left, the head, in profile nonetheless, and feet of Figaro, the black and white tuxedo cat, while atop a table swims the fish Cleo in her fishbowl. Appropriately enough, the festive gathering is overseen by Geppetto, whose mustachioed head juts into the picture plane at a right angle, a naive shift of perspective that unintentionally lends both visual wit and a sense of the uncanny to the unlikely scene. The roundness of Geppetto's disembodied head mimics the globe of the fishbowl as it simultaneously becomes both a part of the tabletop and the surface upon which the bowl rests. By showing you this drawing, I don't mean to suggest that one needs to study or interpret the creative work of a kindergarten artist the way one would the artistic output of a mature artist, although I do think this drawing is quite a remarkable feat for a child so young. Nor do I think it is the key that unlocks the aforementioned mystery of Bellows' adult accomplishments. Instead, I started my talk with this cheery piece of Bellows' juvenilia because it illustrates to me the possibility of a very early engagement on the part of the artist with the medium of film. Although the Disney movie Pinocchio was first released in 1940, before Kent Bellows was born, it was re-released in theaters in the United States in 1954, the year before Bellows completed his drawing. It is therefore possible that the young artist saw the feature either in Omaha, where he was living at the time, or in Blair, Nebraska, during one of the family's trips to visit family in their hometown. According to Bellows' sister Deb, it is very likely that an outing to see Pinocchio would have taken place, as she says, "We all saw all the Disney movies as soon as they were out when I was a kid." and mostly at Blair's home theater, which you see in a vintage photo there. The Bellows family moved back to Blair when Kent was 9 and stayed until he was 15, and the home theater was a place of significance for Bellows, which he immortalized in a 1973 painting entitled Home, a work that is both an homage to his hometown and to his love of movies, especially the campy science fiction movies whose aesthetic aura he seems to be trying to reproduce here. Bellows' love of the movies never waned. At the time of his death in 2005, the artist possessed a personal film library whose contents numbered almost 200 DVDs. His personal notebooks contain a hand-copied list of the American Film Institute's top 100 films of all time, annotated by the artist with directors' names, check marks, circles, and underlinings, which seemingly indicated movies he liked, had seen, or perhaps wanted to see. His notebooks also contain numerous references to specific films he found interesting, often noting the exact times of relevant scenes and affecting imagery. While working out ideas for paintings and drawings, Bellows would give himself movie-watching homework assignments, which were usually self-directives to revisit films that were visually memorable in some way. For instance, while developing his ideas for the never-completed Sen painting, Lust, Bellows writes to himself, quote, "Movie assignments, second half of Full Metal Jacket, especially final scenes, architecture, of course. Don't forget the scene with the corpse. Next assignment, Last Tango in Paris." Furthermore, Bellows once characterized his works as, quote, "little movies that don't move." Bellows' taste in film was wide-ranging but circumscribable. He admired both the challenging works of the great existentialist art house filmmakers of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, including Bergman, Fellini, Bertolucci, Buñuel, and Kurosawa, and the psychological thrillers of Hitchcock, as well as the more contemporary modernist and grotesque films of David Lynch, Wim Wenders, and the Coen brothers. He loved 1950s genre films, horror and sci-fi classics such as Godzilla and It Came from Outer Space, and the campy, low-budget films of Ed Wood. Bellows was equally fascinated by the more recent science fiction films featuring creatures from beyond, such as Close Encounters of the Third Kind and Alien, and postmodern sci-fi classics such as Blade Runner and The Matrix. Also well represented were, in his movie collection, are intensely gory and psychologically shocking horror films such as Halloween and The Silence of the Lambs, and significantly, as it relates to his later compositions, the disturbing David Fincher thriller, Seven. For those who knew Bellows well, this inventory may come as no surprise. For those newly introduced to his work, however, or who are familiar with his photorealistic portraiture, much of which is on view in the Joslin exhibition, but who were not acquainted with the artist himself, this list might strike one as curious or as an epistemological oddity. For the bulk of what he watched when he popped a DVD into the player, with the exception perhaps of movies dealing with the Vietnam War, was not realist by definition, but was modernist, fantastical, melodramatic, or requiring a good deal of interpretive labor to understand. What the Joslin exhibition intends to express through its title, however, is that Bellows' production as an artist cannot be relegated to the simple category of realism, that for Bellows, art making was an intellectually creative activity as much as it was a display of mimetic virtuosity or imitative skill, and that ultimately in Bellows, as in Hitchcock and Bergman, all is not always as it appears to be. Although Bellows employed a realist technique, focusing on precise and accurate marks upon paper and panel, and his works embodied a real-world aesthetic in their almost photographic-like appearance, he was intellectually engaged with a breadth of pop and visual culture sources that suggested alternative, more expressive ways of evoking psychological states and imaginative departures from actuality. Reality, according to Bellows, quote, "is the one word which should always be in quotes." What I want to explore tonight is Bellows' lifelong interest in movies and film, and that medium's role as a source of thematic and formal ideas and inspiration for the artist. I believe that film also maintained a certain relevance to Bellows as a correlative to the self-consciously artificial realism to which the artist himself aspired. That is, the reproduction of a non-indexical reality, which has been purely fabricated by the artist. As Bellows once described his working method, quote, "I will methodically create a reality in the three-dimensional space of the studio and then go about the business of depicting it." Looking through an art historical lens, it is clear enough to us that Bellows admired and borrowed ideas from such artists as Rembrandt, Akins, and Masaccio, but it is also important to note his ongoing engagement with such genres as horror and sci-fi, and such filmmakers as Bergman, Hitchcock, and Fincher, with a little Disney animation and Godzilla thrown in. As Bellows' career progressed, he tried different strategies to incorporate ideas from movies and the filmmaking process itself into his own praxis, an effort that culminated in his last series of works, his ambitious, unfinished cycle of paintings on the 7 deadly sins, in which his foremost sources of visual inspiration were contemporary Hollywood movies. Early on, when he passed the stage of being interested in Disney, Bellows was drawn to monster movies and alien sci-fi films. At about age 13, he sketched this image, which I believe is The Phantom of the Opera, an early silent film starring Lon Chaney, and probably one of the Friday night horror movies for teens that Bellows and friend David O'Hanlon attended in Blair. O'Hanlon remembers going with Kent to the Home, as they called the local theater, many, many times, he says, literally on a weekly basis, where they would see films like The Tingler and the Edgar Allan Poe adaptation starring Vincent Price. Bellows' fascination with such themes inspired him in 1964 at the age of 14, and after already being awarded the title of Best Monster Maker in the state of Nebraska, which is an amazing title to hold, I think, to enter a national contest sponsored by the Aurora Plastics Corporation and Universal Studios, which required him to build a miniature monster movie set. According to the reporter who covered the event for the Blair Enterprise, Bellows' set showed, quote, "a great deal of artistic and mechanical talent." But it was science fiction that ultimately captured Bellows' interest as a genre that he might exploit in order to make money as a visual artist. And he featured the theme of alien contact in a work he produced in 1977, the year both the original Star Wars movie and Close Encounters of the Third Kind were released. Not of This Earth, which you see here, served as the original for a limited edition series of posters produced by Watchdog Graphics, a company that consisted of Bellows and his friend O'Hanlon. The poster sold for $3.50 and was available through ads in science fiction magazines. Taking his cue from an earlier generation of sci-fi movies, those of the 1950s, Bellows gives us a classic flying saucer scene, complete with glowing alien and set within an ominously craggy, deserted canyon. Deserted save for the unsuspecting young couple who appear to have been dropped directly from a 1950s Blair High School homecoming game. Bellows completed many sci-fi and fantasy-themed paintings and drawings, some of which explore the idea of fantastical, futuristic societies, while others visualize varieties of alien, android, and cyborg creatures. Here's another one. Bellows' enduring interest in the kind of surreal world of the sci-fi movie with technicolor hues and unlikely life forms is evidenced in his portrait of science fiction writer Philip K. Dick, which the artist created as an illustration for a Rolling Stone magazine feature that appeared in the November 6, 1975 issue. Although Bellows' fascination with the popular genre films he loved so much as a teenager persisted throughout his life, and a case in point, is this wonderful painting, Apocalyptic Still Life with Flying White House, Nuclear Winter. I'm showing you a detail here where, among other things, the artist depicts his continued practice of monster model making, the results shown here in his studio with Godzilla presiding over the scene. As he matured as an artist, he also expanded the possibilities of his source material, both in the realm of art historical influences and from the increasingly available film offerings of the movie houses showing foreign films. And Bellows' chosen medium and subject matter, black and white pencil renderings of individuals in a variety of states of mind, evince not only a visual resemblance to the works of many foreign filmmakers, but he exhibited as well a comparable interest in the presence of narratives which are complicated by psychological tension and incomplete information. These are narratives in which the viewer must work to draw out meaning. For to Bellows, quote, "There's nothing more boring than a story too quickly told," end quote. The early horror and science fiction films that Bellows was attracted to in his formative years relied heavily on dramatic juxtapositions of light and dark, shadow and sunlight to overcome the limitations of the black and white medium. The works of filmmakers like Bergman and Kurosawa, however, used a black and white aesthetic in new, sophisticated ways in an effort to raise the status of film to that of an art form. Perhaps Bellows recognized something of his own preoccupations and ambitions in what these filmmakers were trying to do. One of the directors who Bellows was drawn to was Ingmar Bergman, whose psychologically gripping plots, often involving strained relationships between family members, were often more cerebral than action-packed. Bergman's stylistic innovations with the movie camera allowed him to communicate powerful emotional content through technique. For instance, intimate close-ups of faces help to convey characters' complex psychological states and intense feelings. Single camera shots linger on scenes, and extended silences allow the viewer to engage in prolonged contemplation. Stark black and white imagery gives light and dark the capacity to expressively convey emotional terrains. The result is that Bergman's films, lyrically stylized to the point of uniqueness, are immediately recognizable as Bergman films. And this is something that Bellows appreciated very much in the Swedish director and strove for in his own body of work. Said Bellows, quote, "I try to make art that is really part of me, that there is just no question about it. I get that from a Bergman film. I get that from Scorsese. I get that from David Lynch." One visual technique that Bergman was fond of, and which certainly would have impressed Bellows, was the director's interest in capturing characters and bodies as they appear through the mediation of translucent or semi-transparent materials, as in this film still from his 1965 movie Persona. Sorry, it's dark. Where the character Alma's face slowly reveals itself from behind a sheer curtain. Or in The Silence, when we see the boy Johann's face through the glass window of the train. Bellows' own ability to render the human form beneath or through other materials was astonishing, as he similarly played with the transparency of fabric in a work such as Isha, Woman in a Yellow Dress, where the artist skillfully differentiates between the uncovered body and that same body as it appears underneath and through a diaphanous covering. Or in the remarkable Sarah Sleeping, where the figure's body is no less convincing as a form beneath the voluminous drapery as it is revealed. And here we see that Bergman was also attracted to the possibilities of the white sheet as an evocative covering. And in a work such as Bellows' Through the Frosted Glass, whose title echoes that of Bergman's celebrated film of 1960, Through a Glass Darkly, the artist meticulously crafts a depiction of a woman behind a glass shower door, her nude form wholly readable, yet abstracted by both the texture of the glass and the droplets of water which adhere to the pane. Here, Bellows goes one step further into the terrain of the cinematic, by imbuing the scene with the potential for narrative and psychological intensity. As Omaha World Herald art critic Kyle McMillan suggested in an interview with the artist in 1992, the same interview in which he invoked the name of Bergman, this work, quote, is less concerned with the physical reality of a woman in a shower than the story it suggests, the questions it raises, the feelings it provokes, end quote. To which Bellows responded, quote, there's a time bomb ticking inside of it. When the viewer is able to focus on the scene itself, rather than the artist's remarkable display of skill, we begin to see something else, namely, we begin to wonder about the figure's vulnerable yet protective pose as she stands immobilized, perhaps letting the water cleanse away the memory of past events. And, of course, since this is Bellows after all, the image certainly alludes to the infamous shower scene in Hitchcock's Psycho. Bellows owned copies of at least 6 Bergman movies, including Through a Glass Darkly, a film in which the liminal mental state of the main character, Karen, is revealed through her interaction with and juxtaposition against the inanimate wallpaper of a vacant attic room. The camera lingers on Karen's face set against the peeling wall covering, eventually focusing in on a tear in the background element itself. As a gap expressive of Karen's schizophrenia. The idea that backgrounds in and of themselves could be revelatory in the artist's effort to convey human psychology was one that Bellows shared with Bergman. As highly detailed as the foreground figures, Bellows' patterned backgrounds, textured, weathered, irregular, smooth, linear, repetitive, offer insights into the sitter's personalities. The rich and expressive background in a work such as Jackie, December 1997, for instance, implies mental states and expresses conditions that might not be recognizable were the figure considered in isolation. Here, the flaking layers of the aging and variegated wall correspond perhaps to the subject's capacity to endure, her will to weather the storms of existence. While the backgrounds of other works suggest the subject's emotional impenetrability, or perhaps the individual's own worldly innocence. Bergman's commitment to filming many of his movies in black and white, in contrast to the saturated Technicolor films of the time, required that he and his cinematographer develop inventive techniques to establish the contemporaneity of the films while heightening the expressive potential of light and dark. In scenes such as the one captured here, which I hope you can see, she's looking at a television. In this still image from Persona, we see Bergman's ability to convey the nascent madness of the character Elizabeth through her stunned engagement with her hospital room television, as she is both drawn to the room's only visible light source and simultaneously appalled by what she sees on the screen, which is the now iconic image of the horrific self-immolation of a Buddhist monk. Bellows used a similar device and atmosphere of madness in his drawing Changing Channels, which is a self-portrait of the artist in a straitjacket and confined to a wheelchair, unable to move away from the mesmerizing glow of the TV screen, which projects its brightness onto the face and body of the figure. Although the narrative here is strange and enigmatic, as in the Bergman scene, it speaks to a human crisis, to one's inability to control the nature of mass culture images that are placed before us. Bellows' attraction to portraiture as his primary mode of communication situates his work in sympathy with that of the existentialist-minded filmmakers of the 50s and 60s, and it is not insignificant that his portrait subjects very often make direct eye contact with the viewer, thus acknowledging his or her own status as a social agent and thinking being. In his notes, Bellows reflects upon a particular scene in the Bergman movie Summer with Monica, quoting Bergman's own words from a passage in one of his books. And Bergman's words are, Quote, "With the swing music resounding, the camera turns to Harriet. She shifts her glance from her partner straight into the lens. Here is suddenly established for the first time in the history of film," and Bellows underlines the previous phrase, "shameless direct contact with the viewer." And I hope we can see this, but here's the scene in question. It's short. Bellows recognized in Bergman's technique a worldview similar to his own, an appreciation of the power of visual encounters between individuals and the insights that can be established by the direct and prolonged contemplation of the human face. Bellows' most powerful portraits are the ones in which the subject's facial expressions, like Monica's in this clip, are direct and challenging, but ambiguous just the same. We see this in works like the previous work, Megan, in many of the portraits of Bellows' second wife, Angie, and in those of other family members, such as this psychologically complex drawing of his stepdaughter, Rachel. And perhaps most profoundly, if we can go there, we see it in Bellows' self-portraits, where through our direct engagement with the artist's own physiognomy, we are being asked to extract some element of the artist himself, of who he was at the moment his own image came into being. In December of 1995, again in reference to the book on Bergman that he owned, Bellows wrote in his notebook, quote, "It's interesting how many of these film stills are truly expressive as pictorial inventions. Don't forget this idea. Create your own filmic narratives, complete with characters, storylines, settings, etc. See where they lead. Allow your mental projector to freeze frame, somewhat arbitrarily. Examine the results. You could be surprised," end quote. This new metaphor, one built upon his earlier interest in creating little movies that don't move, became the driving force behind Bellows' conception of an ambitious series of multi-figure works documenting contemporary manifestations of the 7 deadly sins, which he left uncompleted at the time of his death. The new focus on filmic narratives marked a turning point in his thinking about the compositional process itself, about how best to go about creating images that were not primarily about the personalities of the sitters, but instead carried within them a deeper storyline. The process of developing ideas for and executing paintings that conveyed in narrative form the sins of lust, gluttony, greed, sloth, wrath, envy, and pride preoccupied Bellows during the last years of his life as he became his own kind of movie maker, conceiving of backstories for his sinners, all of whom would be played by Bellows himself, building elaborate sets in his studio, and importantly, regularly viewing contemporary movies in search of general representational strategies and specific visual details to help convey the complex states of his characters. One thing that Bellows would do, and we see it also in some works unrelated to the Sins series, such as here in Father's Day Self-Portrait, summer 1997, which was completed just before he began work on his first sin painting, Gluttony, is that he would isolate and copy a film's effective use of props to convey atmosphere. For instance, Bellows' use of the white sheet to conceal objects in the left foreground is a direct borrowing of a visual idea from the movie Last Tango in Paris. Bellows took note in his journal of, quote, mysterious objects covered with sheets, see Last Tango, and quoted in his drawing not only the compelling imagery, but also the sense of uneasiness the strange object produces in the viewer as we wonder just what is being intentionally obscured underneath. Last Tango in Paris also served as a point of reference, and appropriately so, for Bellows' ideas for his never-realized sin painting, Lust. At one point, after completing a color study for the project, which you see here, it's dark, he gave himself the assignment of watching the movie again, paying particular attention to the color of the walls in the apartment. During the production of the Sin series, however, Bellows' movie watching tended more towards the action-packed thrillers of Ridley Scott and David Fincher than the more subtle psychodramas of Bergman or Bertolucci, which makes sense because, as Bellows interpreted them, the seven deadly sins were not just about excess, but described perversions as well. It was his intention to depict a cycle of scenes of intense moral debauchery played out within the framework of the corrupting forces of modern society. So Bellows' conception of Wrath, for instance, which you see here, a kind of horror movie envisioning of the results of unrestrained anger, presents a bizarre narrative in which the artist himself plays the role of a psychopath whose own suicide assures the continuing suffering and eventual death of his helpless victim. Quote, righteous anger is one thing, stated the artist, but anger is worse when perverted into unacceptable, inexplicable violence. The scene calls to mind, I'll have to describe it, settings found in today's serial killer movies, often carefully designed yet crude underground spaces where hideous acts take place, as in Buffalo Bill's well in Silence of the Lambs, which is what this is, if you've seen that movie. He's looking down. It's a sort of a stone well underground, and there's a girl down there. And one is also reminded of Hannibal Lecter's highly secure underground cell, which also had these big stone walls. It's underground. Bellows' working practice had always involved a preliminary choreography of props and background elements, a careful and deliberate placement of objects and models within a predetermined space in his studio. As preparatory work for Wrath and Lust, however, and to an extent for his first sin painting, Gluttony, Bellows began constructing larger, all-encompassing environments that were akin to stage sets for movies, which better allowed for the possibility of narrative content. The Wrath set, as I discussed in my catalog essay, if you've read it, was constructed in the large north room of Bellows' Leavenworth Street studio and took the artist and assistant several months to build. The chamber was fabricated out of an unusual array of materials, including 2x4 boards, corrugated cardboard panels, boxes, paper mache, and perhaps most importantly, great stuff insulating spray foam whose consistency replicated the texture of excavated earth. Into this material, he embedded disquieting items such as a cow's skull and a set of bronzed baby shoes. The final product was an uncanny, monochromatic cave-like space where Bellows' sin of wrath could be convincingly dramatized. Color was added not to the scene itself, but to the painted version of the scene. As Bellows' art-making practice fell more in line with the material prerequisites for movie making, his thoughts about the importance of narrative, especially as it served as a backstory for the main character, the sinner, became paramount. For the Lust composition, the setting and the objects within it had to give the viewer insight into the mind and personality of the protagonist. Before Bellows could begin visualizing concrete elements that he intended to incorporate into the Lust scene, he first went about imagining the life and personality of the scene's main character. Who is this guy? Bellows queried himself in his notes, eventually deciding that the guy, as he always referred to him, was a debauched artist. Don't forget, Bellows writes, he's an artist. Maybe mediocre, like you, in parentheses, but an artist nonetheless. And elsewhere, quote, remember, this guy's a mediocre artist. Developing a notion of just who the sinner was, what kind of person he was a necessary step in the conception of the work itself. Bellows would expand the storyline, adding additional information about the character in a 2002 videotaped interview about the project, where he notes that, quote, this guy, he lives in this completely abject, dilapidated environment, but he's got a really good TV. I'll probably use my Sony flat screen because he's got a really good TV. And more about the sin of lust, quote, it's not just excess. The guy's made a kind of right turn into this onanistic, very private world. To refine his vision of the abject, dilapidated living space that the lust character inhabited, Bellows turned to his extensive DVD library, where this scene from the movie Pollock gave him the idea for beat-up walls with horizontal slats. But, he exclaims in his notes, don't forget how eccentric this place may be. Horizontal slats, all right, but maybe extremely irregular and jerry-built. And while watching the David Fincher drama Fight Club, and I fear that these slides are going to be really dark, yes, Bellows registers his interest in the window treatments here, noting again the irregular horizontal slats up in the window area there. He says, quote, irregular horizontal slats, maybe just a few, so there's still enough light. I'm talking about the primary window, front right. He was also drawn to this scene where he appeared fascinated by, quote, some kind of thin comforter or mattress wrapped with duct tape. This is a scene from Fight Club down in the basement, and there are various figures, but there's some sort of supporting poles that are wrapped with mattresses, and then the duct tape sort of goes around them like that. And interesting patterns on the wall, and here you can't see it at all, but if you could see it, you would see that the wall is this kind of peeling paint that you see in a lot of Bellows' drawings, because that's what was happening in his studio as well, the peeling paint, the stucco underneath, which was interesting to him. During his planning for Lust, Bellows watched Donnie Darko, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Sleepy Hollow, as well as True Romance, and as we have seen, Last Tango in Paris. But the most voluminous references in his notes for the composition are to David Fincher's horrific crime drama, Seven, the plot of which revolves around a serial killer whose sadistic murders are a twisted attempt to show the world what sort of punishment to expect if you commit one of the 7 deadly sins. It is, in fact, possible that Bellows' initial idea for a series of paintings depicting the 7 deadly sins came from his encounter with this popular crime drama. In any event, some of Bellows' most developed descriptive motifs regarding the atmosphere and lighting of the never-realized composition came from the film. For instance, Bellows isolates this still image, noting, look at window treatment at 2145. Whatever the material is covering that window, some kind of fabric, replace it with torn shower curtain. Always has creepy connotations, and then in parentheses, e.g. psycho. In the later video interview to which I referred earlier, Bellows describes his concept of the shower curtain window, remarking that, quote, I got this weird idea, I don't know why, but to have a shower curtain and a pole with the little rings, and this window will be covered by a shower curtain. But clearly the image that he was remembering there came from the window treatments in Seven, because he referred to those earlier in his notes, which he decided to combine with the psycho element. The other source of light in the composition was to come from the lit screen of a TV. Remember the similar effect in the Bergman scene, as well as Bellows drawing changing channels. Bellows reproducing in his Lust notes the image of a TV stacked on top of another TV, also a motif taken from the movie Seven. Among other unexpressively dark visual details, this is again an image with that peeling paint on the wall. Bellows loved the movie's peeling paint wall treatments, and this sort of background shows up in numerous Bellows works. Here you can kind of see it a little better.